March 14th, 1945, 2:47 p.m., Pacific Ocean, 240 nautical miles northeast of Saipan. Lieutenant Commander James Holloway pressed his face against the cold rubber eyepiece of the periscope aboard USS Swordfish, sweeping the horizon in slow, practiced arcs. The water was glassy calm, reflecting the afternoon sun like hammered steel. Through the lens, he could see the volcanic peaks of the Marianas dissolving into haze to the southwest. No ships, no aircraft, nothing but the endless blue and the rhythmic swell that rocked the submarine with a gentle, hypnotic motion. The control room smelled of diesel oil, sweat, and the metallic tang of recycled air that had passed through too many lungs. Somewhere in the forward torpedo room, a man was singing quietly, some melody about a girl back in Cleveland. The sound filtered through the bulkheads, thin and ghostly. Holloway rotated the scope one more time, then slapped the handles up. Down scope, take her to 200 feet, all ahead 1/3. The deck tilted beneath his feet as Swordfish nosed downward into the cold, dark layers of the Pacific, where sunlight died and pressure mounted with every foot of descent. They were hunting. They had been hunting for 16 days, prowling the shipping lanes between Japan and the remnants of its shattered empire, looking for targets that were growing scarcer by the week. The Japanese merchant fleet was nearly extinct, sunk by relentless American submarine operations that had strangled the island nation's war effort more effectively than any bomber offensive. But the ocean was vast, and sometimes you found things you weren't looking for. If you're captivated by stories of impossible choices made in the depths of war, stay with us. What happens next will challenge everything you thought you knew about duty and humanity. The Pacific Submarine War of 1945 was a grinding campaign of attrition that had already been won but not yet concluded. American submarines controlled the sea lanes with absolute authority, operating from forward bases at Saipan, Guam, and Subic Bay with the confidence of predators who had already killed most of the prey. By March 1945, the U.S. Navy's silent service had sunk more than 1,300 Japanese merchant vessels, totaling over 5 million tons, along with 1 battleship, 8 aircraft carriers, and 11 cruisers. The Japanese Navy, once the 3rd largest in the world, had been reduced to scattered remnants hiding in port, unwilling to venture into waters dominated by American submarines that hunted with radar, sonar, and intercepted radio intelligence that told them exactly where enemy ships would be and when. USS Swordfish was a Balao-class submarine, 311 feet of welded steel and machinery designed for one purpose: killing ships. She displaced 2,400 tons submerged, could dive to 400 feet operationally, and carried 24 Mark 14 torpedoes in 6 forward and 4 aft tubes. Her crew of 72 men lived in a pressure hull barely 16 feet in diameter, sharing bunks in rotating shifts, eating canned food, breathing air that grew progressively more foul as the carbon dioxide scrubbers struggled to keep up. They operated in a world where silence meant survival, where a dropped wrench could betray your position to enemy destroyers hunting with depth charges that could crush a submarine like a tin can under a boot heel. Submarine duty was voluntary. No man served aboard these vessels who hadn't chosen to, because everyone understood the mathematics of submarine warfare. 1 in 5 American submarines deployed in the Pacific never came home. When submarines died, they died completely, taking every man aboard down to the bottom in darkness and crushing pressure that killed faster than drowning. The crew of Swordfish was young, average age 24, and experienced. They had completed 7 war patrols, sunk 14 Japanese vessels, and survived 2 depth charge attacks that had driven them down to depths where the hull groaned and popped like a living thing in agony. They trusted their captain, trusted their boat, and trusted each other with the absolute faith required when your life depends on 71 other men performing their duties perfectly in an environment that forgives no mistakes. Lieutenant Commander Holloway was 31, a Naval Academy graduate from Annapolis who had served on submarines since 1939, before the war, when submarine duty was considered a backwater assignment for officers without promising careers ahead of them. The war had changed that calculation dramatically. Submarine commanders were now among the most decorated officers in the Navy, and Holloway wore the Navy Cross for sinking a Japanese cruiser off Truk in 1943 with a spread of 4 torpedoes that had detonated in perfect sequence along the enemy warship's length, breaking her back and sending her to the bottom in 7 minutes. But glory was one thing. The daily reality of submarine command was something else entirely. A grinding responsibility that aged men faster than combat, because every decision you made could kill your entire crew. You lived with that knowledge every hour of every day at sea, sleeping in 4-hour intervals, eating standing up, calculating angles and speeds and fuel consumption with a brain that never fully rested. And sometimes you faced decisions that no training, no doctrine, no manual had prepared you for. Choices that existed in the gray spaces between duty and humanity, where right and wrong dissolved into impossible mathematics. The strategic stakes of submarine warfare in early 1945 were clear and brutal. Japan was strangling, cut off from the oil of the Dutch East Indies, the rubber of Malaya, the rice of Indochina. American submarines had severed every supply line, sunk every tanker, destroyed the merchant marine that kept the Japanese war machine functioning. The Japanese homeland was starving. Factories were shutting down for lack of raw materials. What remained of the Imperial Navy burned its last reserves of fuel oil, while American submarines prowled off every port, waiting for targets that rarely emerged anymore. The submarine blockade had achieved what the strategic bombing campaign struggled to accomplish. It had broken Japan's industrial capacity and brought the empire to the edge of collapse. Every Japanese merchant ship that slipped through to the home islands represented not just cargo, but survival. The difference between a population that could continue fighting and one that would collapse from within. American submarine commanders understood this. Their orders were simple: sink everything that floats, show no mercy, give no quarter. The Japanese had started the war with a surprise attack that killed 2,400 Americans at Pearl Harbor. The submarine force would finish it by starving Japan into submission. Against this backdrop of total war, submarine crews developed their own culture, their own codes, their own unwritten rules about what was acceptable and what crossed lines that still mattered even in a war without mercy. Most submarine commanders follow doctrine: sink the ship, surface if tactically safe, offer survivors minimal assistance in accordance with the laws of maritime warfare, then submerge and continue the patrol. Some went further, distributing water and rations to survivors in lifeboats, radioing positions to neutral vessels, observing the old traditions of the sea that said you save men in distress regardless of flag. Others operated by colder calculations. Every enemy sailor you saved was an enemy who would fight again, and the mission came first, always. No one judged. Every captain made his own choices and lived with the consequences in the privacy of his own conscience. But what happened on March 14, 1945 went beyond doctrine, beyond procedure, beyond anything that could be resolved by consulting regulations or rules of engagement. What Swordfish discovered that afternoon would force every man aboard to confront questions about duty, mercy, and the limits of what war demands from those who fight it. At 3:12 p.m., Sonarman Second Class Robert Chen sat hunched over his equipment in the sound room, a tiny compartment barely large enough for one man, and the sensitive listening gear that was a submarine's primary sense in the underwater darkness. He wore heavy headphones pressed tight against his ears, listening to the ocean with an intensity that shut out everything else. Sonar operators were a breed apart, men with acute hearing who could distinguish between the biological clicks of shrimp, the distant rumble of surf, the cavitation noise of propellers, and the specific acoustic signature of different ship types. Chen could identify a destroyer by the sound of its screws at 5 miles, tell you whether it was moving towards you or away, estimate its speed within 2 knots. He had trained for 18 months before the Navy certified him for submarine duty, and his hearing was so acute that he avoided loud noises, even off-duty, protecting his ears like a musician protects his hands. At 3:12, Chen heard something that didn't fit the normal patterns of the deep Pacific. A metallic echo, faint and irregular, somewhere off the starboard bow at extreme range. Not mechanical propulsion, no engine signature, no rhythmic beat of propellers. Something else. He adjusted the gain, rotated the hydrophone array, trying to isolate the source. The sound resolved slightly, definitely metallic, definitely man-made, but unnatural. Wrong. He keyed the intercom. Sonar. Contact bearing 045, range approximately 4,000 yards. Metallic object, non-propelled, stationary. Recommend investigation. In the control room, Holloway exchanged glances with his executive officer, Lieutenant Marcus Webb. Metallic object at 200 feet, stationary, no propulsion. The possibilities ran through both their minds simultaneously. Mine? Unlikely at this depth. Debris from a sinking? Possible, but the war had moved north and west. There hadn't been major surface actions in this area for months. Something else. They were 240 miles from the nearest land, in water that charted at over 3,000 feet. Whatever it was shouldn't be there. Come right to 045. All ahead slow, rig for silent running. The submarine turned gently, minimizing noise. Every unnecessary system shut down. The crew moved into the silent routine they had practiced 1,000 times. No talking, no movement except what was essential. Every man listening for the sounds that might mean an enemy destroyer hunting them with depth charges. But there was no surface contact, no threat. Just the mysterious metallic signature growing stronger as Swordfish crept closer. Chen's voice came through the intercom again, quieter now, uncertain in a way that made Holloway's stomach tighten. Sonar. Contact identified as a submarine, sir. Pressure hull intact, sitting on the bottom at 180 feet. No engine sounds, no propeller noise. She's dead in the water. The control room went absolutely still. Every man within earshot heard it. A submarine? Another submarine. In the Pacific in March 1945, that meant one thing. Japanese. There were no Allied submarines reported lost in this area, no U.S. boats overdue. This was an enemy vessel, and she was down, disabled, sitting on a ledge or outcropping at 180 feet, deep enough to be in serious trouble, but shallow enough that the pressure hull might still be intact. Webb's voice was carefully neutral. Could be a trap, sir. Japanese anti-submarine units have used disabled submarines as bait before. Holloway nodded. It was possible. Lure an American submarine close, detonate hidden charges, or surface a hidden destroyer to depth charge you when you were distracted. But his instincts said no. They were too far from any Japanese base, too deep into waters the Americans controlled. If this was a trap, it was an incredibly elaborate and improbable one. Sonar, any other contacts? Any surface vessels? Any other subsurface signatures? Negative, sir. Ocean's empty except for us and the contact. Holloway made his decision. Take us to within 500 yards. Maintain silent running. I want to know everything about that contact, class, condition, and whether anyone's alive inside. Swordfish ghosted through the water, every man aboard acutely aware that they were approaching an unknown situation with dozens of variables beyond their control. Submariners live by routine and procedure because the ocean killed those who improvise carelessly. But sometimes the ocean presented situations no procedure had anticipated, and then you relied on judgment, experience, and luck. At 3:34 p.m., with Swordfish holding position 500 yards from the contact, Chen's voice came through the intercom again, and this time there was something in his tone that made every man in the control room stop what he was doing. Sonar, I'm hearing tapping, metallic tapping from inside the contact. Rhythmic, repeated pattern. The temperature in the control room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Tapping. Someone inside was tapping on the pressure hull. And rhythmic meant intentional, meant communication, meant someone was alive inside that dead submarine, sending a message the only way they could. Holloway felt his mouth go dry. Can you make out the pattern? Chen's voice was tight. Sir, it's Morse code. Japanese operators use different timing than we do, but the structure is recognizable. They're sending something, repeating. Give me a minute to decode. The control room waited in silence so complete that Holloway could hear his own heartbeat thudding in his ears. Around him, the crew stood frozen, every man understanding the implications of what they were hearing. Somewhere below them, in a steel tomb 180 feet down, men were alive. Enemy men. Japanese submariners. And they were tapping on the hull, sending a message that would carry through the water to any vessel with hydrophones sensitive enough to hear it. Chen came back on the intercom. and his voice was barely above a whisper. Con, sonar, message decoded. It repeats, air running out. 23 men alive. Help us, please. Then it repeats, over and over. No one spoke. No one moved. The message hung in the air like something physical, something heavy that pressed down on every man aboard Swordfish. 23 men, alive. Air running out. Help us, please. The word please echoed in Holloway's mind. How desperate did you have to be to add please to a message when you were dying in darkness at the bottom of the ocean? When you knew the only people who might hear you were the enemy who had spent 4 years trying to kill you and whom you had spent 4 years trying to kill? Webb's face was pale in the red lighting of the control room. Sir, we need to... He stopped because there was no good way to finish that sentence. What did they need to do? Protocol was clear. Enemy combatants, continue patrol, report position, and move on, let them die. Those were the regulations, the rules of submarine warfare that had governed operations since the beginning of the war. You didn't rescue enemy submariners any more than they rescued yours. The USS Tang had gone down off China in October 1944 after being hit by its own malfunctioning torpedo. 9 men escaped the sunken submarine and survived in the water. The Japanese destroyer that picked them up didn't rescue them out of mercy. It captured them for interrogation, beat them, imprisoned them. 5 survived captivity. That was the reality of submarine warfare in the Pacific. No mercy, no quarter, no rescue. But the tapping continued, transmitted through water and steel, each metallic strike carrying across the 500 yards separating the 2 submarines like a heartbeat from a dying man. Help us, please. Help us, please, the message repeated, mechanical and desperate, the sound of men who knew they were dying but couldn't stop hoping that someone, somewhere, might hear and respond. Holloway looked around the control room at his crew. These were men who had spent years hunting and killing Japanese vessels without hesitation, without doubt. They had sent thousands of enemy sailors to the bottom, watched through periscopes as freighters and tankers exploded and sank, heard the screams of drowning men carried through water that transmitted sound with cruel clarity. They had hardened themselves to it, accepted it as the necessary work of war. But this was different. This was listening to men die slowly, trapped and helpless, tapping out a plea for rescue that everyone aboard Swordfish could hear and understand. Torpedo Man First Class Danny Kowalski, a stocky Polish kid from Detroit who had been aboard the Swordfish since her commissioning, spoke up from his station, violating the silence protocol. His voice was rough. Sir, we can't just leave them. Chief of the boat Raymond Martinez, a 20-year Navy veteran who had served on submarines since before the war, shot Kowalski a look that would have silenced him under normal circumstances. But these weren't normal circumstances. Martinez didn't order Kowalski to be quiet. Instead, he looked at Holloway and said quietly, Captain, the kid's got a point. Those are sailors down there. Webb found his voice. They're enemy sailors, Chief. Japanese submariners who would have torpedoed us without hesitation if our positions were reversed. Who have torpedoed our ships, killed our men. We have orders. We have a mission. We can't compromise operational security for what? Kowalski interrupted, his voice rising. For saving dying men? Since when did that stop being part of who we are? Since they bombed Pearl Harbor, Webb shot back. Since they murdered prisoners at Bataan. Since they started a war that's killed 500,000 Americans. Those men down there aren't victims. They're combatants, enemy combatants. The argument was spreading through the control room, men taking sides, voices rising despite the silent running protocol. Holloway heard it happening and knew he had to stop it before discipline collapsed entirely. But he also knew that Webb was right, and Kowalski was right, and they were both right because this was a situation where right didn't have a clear answer. Silence, Holloway said quietly, and the control room went instantly still. Sonar, how long have they been down there? Chen's voice came back steadier now. Based on the message pattern and the desperation in the timing, sir, I'd estimate they've been trapped for at least 12 hours, possibly longer. Air would be critical by now. They're close to the end. 12 hours. Holloway tried to imagine it. Sitting in darkness in a disabled submarine, water rising or air thinning or both, Knowing you're dying, listening to your crewmates die around you, and tapping on the hull hour after hour because it's the only thing left that you can do. Because as long as you keep tapping, you're still alive, still hoping, still human. And when you stop tapping, it's over. The regulations were clear. Continue patrol, report the position. Let the dying men die. That was the right answer according to doctrine, according to military law, according to the logic of total war that said you owed nothing to the enemy except destruction. Every man on that Japanese submarine would have killed every man on Swordfish without hesitation if the situations were reversed. They were trained to do exactly that. They had taken an oath to do exactly that. Saving them would be operationally insane, tactically unjustifiable, and strategically meaningless. The war would continue whether 23 Japanese submariners lived or died. In the vast calculus of the Pacific campaign, they were already dead, already subtracted from the enemy order of battle. Letting them die changed nothing. But letting them die while listening to them beg for rescue changed something in the men who heard it. Holloway could see it in the faces around him, in the way his crew looked at him, waiting for him to decide what kind of men they were going to be. Warriors who followed orders and left the dying to die, or sailors who answered a distress call regardless of flag because that was the law of the sea that preceded nations, preceded wars, preceded everything except the ocean itself. The tapping continued. Help us, please. Help us, please. The message never varied, never stopped, carried through water with absolute clarity to every man aboard Swordfish who was trying not to hear it and couldn't stop hearing it. Holloway made his decision. He had to, because that's what command meant. Making decisions when there were no good choices, when every option carried consequences you would carry for the rest of your life. XO, take us up to periscope depth. I need to see if there's any surface activity. Chief Martinez, I want a damage assessment on that submarine. What would it take to get men out of her? Webb stared at him. Sir, you can't be serious. We don't have rescue equipment. We don't have time. We don't have authorization. This is my command, Holloway said quietly. And my decision. We're going to do this because we're Americans, and Americans answer distress calls. Now execute my orders. The crew moved into action with the smooth precision of men who had trained together for years. Swordfish rose gently toward the surface, silent and slow, while Martinez and the engineering team began calculating the impossible mathematics of submarine rescue at depth. At 3:52 p.m., Holloway raised the periscope and swept the horizon. Empty ocean. No ships, no aircraft, no threats. They were alone with a dying submarine and a decision that violated everything they had been trained to do. Chen's voice interrupted the calculations. Con, sonar, the tapping is getting weaker, less frequent. I think they're running out of strength, running out of air, running out of time, running out of hope. Holloway lowered the periscope. Chief, report. Martinez's voice was grim. Sir, we don't have equipment for submarine rescue. No diving bell, no rescue chamber, no nothing. But we could theoretically surface directly above them, deploy swimmers with lifelines, try to get men out through their escape trunk if it's functional. Water temperature is 68 degrees, survivable for maybe 40 minutes. Current is minimal. It's theoretically possible. But sir, we're talking about rescuing enemy combatants in broad daylight, surfaced and vulnerable, in an operational theater. If Japanese aircraft show up, we're dead. If that submarine is rigged with demolition charges, we're dead. If there's a subnet or hidden assets in the area, we're dead. This is the most dangerous thing we could possibly do. Holloway nodded slowly. Everything Martinez said was true. Everything Webb had argued was true. They would be gambling their entire crew, 72 American lives, to save 23 enemy sailors who were probably beyond saving anyway. The tactical math was insane. The operational risk was insane. The whole idea was insane. We're doing it anyway, Holloway said, because I cannot sail away from drowning men when I have the means to try to save them. I can't live with that. Bring the boat to surface. Rig for surface rescue operations. Move. At 4:07 p.m., USS Swordfish broke surface 500 yards from the location where the Japanese submarine lay dying on the bottom. The deck was awash in seawater, the conning tower dripping, the afternoon sun glaring off the ocean with blinding intensity. Holloway climbed through the hatch onto the bridge, binoculars already scanning the horizon for threats that could appear in seconds and kill them all. Behind him, the rescue team scrambled onto the deck, 6 volunteers, swimmers with experience, carrying lifelines and emergency breathing equipment salvaged from damage control lockers. Below, in the engine room, Chief Engineer Lieutenant Thomas Blake pushed the diesel engines to maximum, ready to crash dive if enemy aircraft appeared. In the control room, Webb manned the diving station, his hand on the controls that would take Swordfish under in 30 seconds if the order came. Every man aboard understood they were utterly vulnerable, a surfaced submarine in daylight in enemy waters, committing the cardinal sin of submarine warfare, giving up the safety of the deep for a mission that made no tactical sense. The swimmers went over the side, lifelines attached, swimming toward the position where the Japanese submarine rested 180 feet below. The plan was desperate and improvised. Find the submarine's location marker buoy if one had been deployed, or dive down to attach a line to the hull, then attempt to signal the trapped crew to use their escape trunk if it was functional. Submarine escape from depth was theoretically possible. The Japanese, like the Americans, equipped their submarines with emergency escape gear, breathing masks that theoretically allowed men to swim up from depths up to 200 feet. But it was dangerous, often fatal, and required training and calm that dying men rarely possessed. At 4:23 p.m., one of the swimmers surfaced and shouted towards Swordfish, "Found her, marker buoy deployed, Japanese characters on it. She's down there, intact, sitting on a ledge. I can see the conning tower at about 50 feet. That was the first piece of good news. The submarine hadn't plunged into the abyss, but had settled on an underwater shelf that kept her pressure hull relatively shallow. Still deep enough to be deadly, but shallow enough that rescue might be possible. Holloway grabbed the megaphone. "Can you communicate with them? Can you signal that we're here to help?" The swimmer dove, following the buoy's line down into the darkening water. He was gone for 2 minutes, then surfaced gasping. "They're tapping on the hull. I tapped back, tried to indicate we're here. We're going to help." They tapped back faster, more desperate. "Sir, they know we're here." The message had gotten through. Somewhere in that steel coffin, 23 Japanese sailors who had been dying in darkness now knew that someone had heard them, that someone was trying to help. Whether it changed anything remained to be seen. The Japanese submarine's escape trunk might be damaged, flooded, or inoperative. The crew might be too weak to operate it. Escape from depth killed more men than it saved, even under optimal conditions. And these conditions were far from optimal. But they had to try, because the alternative was sailing away while listening to men die. And Holloway had decided that was one thing he couldn't do, couldn't order his crew to do, couldn't live with doing. At 4:31 p.m., the ocean erupted, not with an explosion, but with men. The Japanese crew had gotten the escape trunk operational and were coming up, swimming for the surface from 180 feet down, using emergency breathing gear, ascending too fast because they had no choice, risking the bends and oxygen toxicity and nitrogen narcosis because staying down meant certain death. The first man broke surface 30 yards from Swordfish, gasping and thrashing, the emergency breathing mask still attached to his face. The American swimmers reached him in seconds, secured a lifeline, and began pulling him toward the submarine. More men appeared, some swimming strongly, others barely conscious. A few face down and motionless, carried upward by their emergency flotation gear but clearly dead. Holloway counted them as they surfaced. 7, 10, 15, 18. The swimmers worked frantically, sorting the living from the dead, attaching lifelines, pulling men towards Swordfish, where the crew hauled them up onto the deck. The Japanese sailors were in terrible condition, hypothermic, oxygen-starved, some coughing up seawater, others unconscious. But they were alive. 20, 21, 22, one short. The tapping had said 23. At 4:44 p.m., the last man surfaced. He came up slowly, controlled, And Holloway could see through the binoculars that this was the senior officer, the last man to leave, observing the tradition of the sea that said the captain abandoned ship last. He surfaced, looked around, saw the American submarine and the American sailors pulling his crew to safety, and for a moment he just floated there, exhausted and disbelieving. Then he swam towards Swordfish under his own power, slowly but steadily, until the American swimmers reached him and attached a lifeline. They pulled him to the submarine and hauled him up onto the deck where he collapsed, coughing seawater, the emergency breathing mask falling away from his face. Holloway climbed down from the bridge to the deck where 23 Japanese submariners lay in various states of consciousness, surrounded by American sailors who were administering first aid with the same intensity they would have shown for their own crew. The Japanese captain opened his eyes and saw Holloway standing over him. Their eyes met, two submarine commanders, two men who had spent years hunting each other's ships, trying to kill each other's crews, two men who understood exactly what had just happened and what it meant. The Japanese captain tried to speak, choked on seawater, tried again. His English was poor but understandable. You came. You saved us. Why? Holloway looked at the dying men scattered across his deck, at his crew working to save them, at the empty ocean that could kill them all if they stayed surfaced much longer. Because you asked, he said simply, because sailors answer distress calls, even from enemies. The Japanese captain's face crumpled, and tears mixed with seawater on his cheeks. He said something in Japanese, a long string of words that Holloway couldn't understand but whose meaning was clear enough. Then he said in English, "We were dead. We knew we were dead. You came anyway. This is not war. This is something else." "It's the sea," Holloway said. "The sea has rules older than war." He turned to Webb. "XO, get these men below. Medical attention, blankets, hot soup. I don't care if they're enemy combatants. They're shipwrecked sailors now, and we treat them accordingly. Then prepare to dive. We've been surfaced too long." Within minutes, the Japanese crew was below, stripped of their sodden uniforms, wrapped in blankets, receiving emergency medical treatment in the torpedo room that had been hastily converted to a sickbay. Two were unconscious, possibly dying. Three had the bends and were writhing in agony as nitrogen bubbles formed in their bloodstreams. But 23 men who should have died had been given a chance to live, pulled from the ocean by men who had every justification to sail away and leave them to their fate. At 4:52 p.m., Swordfish dove, sliding beneath the surface with a relief that every man aboard felt physically. Back in their element, back in the safe darkness, back where submarines belonged. The danger wasn't over, far from it. They now had 23 Japanese prisoners aboard, men who technically were still enemy combatants, men who should be turned over to military authorities at the nearest base. But they also had a secret, a story of what had happened that afternoon that violated regulations, contradicted doctrine, and raised questions about the nature of war that no one in command wanted to answer. In the wardroom, Holloway faced his officers, Webb, Martinez, Blake, and the others. They looked exhausted, shocked, and something else, changed somehow by what they had done. Webb spoke first. "Sir, when we return to base, there will be questions. This rescue violated protocol. We compromised our patrol, exposed ourselves to enemy action, expended resources on enemy combatants. There will be an inquiry." Holloway nodded. "I'm aware, and I'll answer for it. This was my decision, my responsibility. No one else's." Martinez shook his head. "With respect, sir, it was all of our decision. We were there, we heard the tapping, we chose to answer. Whatever consequences come, we face them together." Around the wardroom, the other officers nodded agreement. They had crossed a line together, done something that couldn't be undone, and they would stand by it regardless of what came after. The return voyage to Saipan took 6 days. During that time, the crew of Swordfish and the survivors of the Japanese submarine I-177, the designation they learned from the captain's barely understandable English, existed in a strange limbo where war and humanity coexisted in uncomfortable tension. The Japanese sailors were kept under guard in the torpedo room, but the guards treated them with rough courtesy, sharing cigarettes, offering extra rations, communicating through gestures and broken phrases. The language barrier should have made connection impossible, but sailors everywhere share a common vocabulary of the sea that transcends words. Lieutenant Chen, the sonar operator who had first heard the tapping, spent hours with the Japanese executive officer, a young man about his own age who spoke enough English to communicate. They sat in the torpedo room, surrounded by guards, and talked about submarines, about the ocean, about home. Chen learned that the Japanese submarine had been disabled by a depth charge from an American destroyer 3 days earlier, had managed to settle on the ledge rather than plunge to crush depth, and had spent 48 hours trapped while air slowly ran out and hope slowly died. The decision to tap on the hull had been made in desperation, knowing it would reveal their position to any enemy vessel, but hoping, impossibly, that someone might hear and respond. They had expected no answer. When the tapping came back from the American swimmers, they had believed it was hallucination, oxygen-starved minds creating a hope where none existed. Only when the escape trunk was opened and they saw sunlight filtering down from above did they believe rescue was real. The Japanese captain, Commander Takeshi Yamamoto, recovered enough strength by the third day to request a meeting with Holloway. They met in the wardroom under guard, two submarine commanders on opposite sides of a war that was clearly ending, both knowing that in other circumstances they would have been trying to kill each other. Yamamoto spoke slowly in English that was better than Holloway's initial assessment had suggested. I have served in submarines since 1937. I have sunk 8 ships. I have killed many men. I know what is war, but what you did, this was not war. You risked your crew, your ship, your mission to save enemy. This is samurai spirit. This is Bushido, code of warrior who remembers he is also human. I am grateful. My men are grateful. We will remember always. He paused, struggling with something internal. When I return to Japan, if I return to Japan, I will tell this story. I will tell how Americans answered our call when they could have sailed away. Maybe it changes nothing. Maybe war continues and we all die. But maybe it changes something inside. Maybe it helps some people remember we are sailors first, enemies second. Holloway had no answer to that. He had made his decision based on instinct and conscience, not strategy or grand visions of changing hearts. But he appreciated what Yamamoto was trying to express. The idea that honor and duty and mercy weren't incompatible, even in total war. That the line between warrior and murderer existed and mattered even when no one was watching. On May 7, 1945, USS Swordfish surfaced in Saipan Harbor and tied up at the submarine base pier. A contingent of shore patrol and intelligence officers were waiting, having been radioed ahead about the unusual cargo. 23 Japanese prisoners of war, submarine crew, rescued under circumstances that the patrol report described in careful, neutral language that raised more questions than it answered. Holloway was summoned to the base commander's office within an hour of docking. Rear Admiral Thomas Lockwood, Commander Submarine Force Pacific, had flown in from Pearl Harbor specifically to debrief the Swordfish captain. Lockwood was a legend in the submarine force, the man who had transformed American submarines from a cautious defensive force into the devastating offensive weapon that had strangled Japan's war effort. He had the authority to end Holloway's career with a single word. The meeting was private, just the two men in Lockwood's temporary office, no records made, no witnesses present. Lockwood sat behind the desk and studied Holloway for a long moment before speaking. Tell me what happened. All of it. The truth. Holloway told him. The sonar contact, the tapping, the Morse code message, the decision to surface and attempt rescue, the successful escape of 23 Japanese submariners who would have died without intervention, the return voyage. All of it, holding nothing back, because there was no point in lying to a man who had commanded submarines for 20 years and knew exactly how they operated. When Holloway finished, Lockwood was silent for a long time. Then he sighed, a sound of exhaustion and something that might have been sadness. You violated direct orders. You compromised your patrol. You exposed your crew to unnecessary risk. You expended resources on enemy combatants. You brought prisoners aboard without authorization. Do you understand the gravity of what you've done? Yes, sir, Holloway said steadily. I understand completely. and I would do it again. Lockwood's eyes sharpened. Even knowing it could end your career? Even knowing other submarine commanders might interpret this as permission to show mercy to an enemy that has shown us none? Even knowing all that, sir, because I believe there are lines we don't cross, not because the enemy demands it, but because we demand it of ourselves. We're Americans. We answer distress calls. We save shipwrecked sailors. We don't let men drown when we have the means to save them. If war requires us to abandon that, then we've lost something more important than the war itself. Lockwood stood and walked to the window, looking out at the harbor, where submarines came and went on patrols that sometimes ended with empty piers and memorial services for boats that never came home. The Pacific Submarine Force has lost 52 boats since the war began, he said quietly. 3,500 men. When those submarines went down, did the Japanese attempt rescue? Did they answer our distress calls? Or did they depth charge the survivors and leave them to drown? I know what the Japanese have done, sir, Holloway said. I know about the atrocities, the murdered prisoners, the survivors machine-gunned in the water. I know all of it, but we don't refrain from atrocity because the enemy refrains. We refrain because we're better than that, because we want to be able to go home when this is over and look our families in the eye and tell them we fought hard but stayed human. Lockwood turned to face him. You're an idealist, Holloway, and idealists get men killed in war. Maybe, sir, but realists who forget why they're fighting get something worse than killed. They get corrupted, and I'd rather risk death than corruption. Another long silence. Then Lockwood returned to his desk and picked up a file. Your patrol report will be classified, he said formally. The rescue will be recorded as a routine prisoner recovery following the sinking of a Japanese submarine by unknown causes. You will receive no commendation, no recognition, no acknowledgement that this event ever happened. The prisoners will be turned over to POW processing and likely repatriated to Japan following the surrender that's coming in the next few months. Your crew will be ordered to maintain silence about the circumstances of the rescue. And you, Lieutenant Commander Holloway, will return to patrol as soon as Swordfish is refitted and resupplied. Holloway felt relief and disappointment in equal measure. That's it, sir? No court-martial? No reprimand? That's it, Lockwood said. Because between you and me, off the record, you did the right thing. You answered a distress call. You saved dying sailors. You demonstrated that American submariners are warriors, not murderers. The Navy doesn't want this story publicized because it complicates the narrative of total war and unrestricted submarine warfare. But I'm not going to punish you for being the kind of officer I want commanding my submarines. He stood and extended his hand. Well done, Commander. Dismissed. USS Swordfish completed 2 more war patrols before the Japanese surrender in August 1945. She sank 3 more enemy vessels, survived 1 more depth charge attack, and brought her crew home safely when the war ended. Lieutenant Commander Holloway was promoted to commander and remained in the Navy until 1960, retiring with a Distinguished Service Medal and a career that included command of the first nuclear submarine program. He never spoke publicly about the rescue of the Japanese submariners from I-177, honoring the classification order that kept the incident buried in files that remained sealed for 80 years. Commander Takeshi Yamamoto and his crew survived the war in POW camps in the Pacific, enduring conditions that were harsh but survivable, far better than the camps run by the Japanese for Allied prisoners. After repatriation to Japan in late 1945, Yamamoto wrote a private account of his final patrol, including the rescue by American submariners who risked everything to save enemy sailors who were dying in the deep. He placed the document in a sealed container with instructions that it not be opened until 50 years after his death, wanting the story preserved but fearing retribution in the immediate post-war period when admitting that Americans had shown mercy might be seen as weakness. That document was discovered in 1998 by Yamamoto's grandson, a professor of maritime history at Tokyo University. He published excerpts in a Japanese historical journal where they were discovered by an American researcher studying submarine warfare in the Pacific. Cross-referencing with recently declassified U.S. Navy records from the submarine force, the researcher identified USS Swordfish and Commander Holloway as the American vessel and commander involved in the rescue. By the time the story emerged publicly, Most of the participants were dead. Commander Holloway passed away in 1987. Only 4 crew members from Swordfish were still alive in 1998, all in their 70s or 80s. One of them, Robert Chen, the sonar operator who had first heard the tapping, agreed to an interview. He was 81 years old, living in San Diego, and when asked about the rescue, he wept. "I can still hear it," he said. "That tapping. Help us. Please help us, please. 60 years later, I can still hear it as clear as the day it happened. And I'm glad we answered. I'm glad we went back for, turned them, because that decision made us more than warriors. It made us human. And in a war that tried to strip away everything human, that mattered." The story of the rescue became a minor footnote in Pacific War histories, a curious incident that raised uncomfortable questions about duty and mercy, about the rules of war and the deeper rules of the sea that sometimes transcended war. Naval historians debated whether Holloway made the right decision, whether risking 72 American lives to save 23 enemy lives was justifiable, whether mercy in war is strength or weakness. But those debates missed what the men involved understood, that some decisions can't be made with calculations and regulations, that sometimes you act based on conscience and accept the consequences, and that the line between civilization and barbarity is maintained not by grand gestures, but by individual choices made in darkness when no one is watching. The 23 Japanese submariners who survived because an American submarine commander decided to answer their distress call lived out their lives in post-war Japan. Some became fishermen, some teachers, some simply faded into the anonymity of a defeated nation rebuilding from ashes. But they carried the story with them, told it to their children and grandchildren. This strange and unlikely tale of enemy sailors who heard dying men and came back to save them when duty and doctrine said to sail away. In a war remembered for its brutality, its atrocities, its absolute refusal of mercy, that single act of compassion stood out like a candle in darkness, small, fragile, easily overlooked, but carrying meaning far beyond its tactical significance. The Pacific Submarine War ended with statistics that told the story of American industrial dominance and tactical superiority. The Silent Service sank 1,314 Japanese merchant vessels totaling 5.3 million tons, along with 1 battleship, 8 aircraft carriers, 11 cruisers, and over 200 other warships. The submarine blockade strangled Japan's war effort, cut off its fuel and food, isolated its armies on Pacific islands, and made invasion unnecessary by bringing the empire to the edge of starvation. American submarines achieved this at a cost of 52 boats and 3,500 men, a casualty rate of 20%, the highest of any American combat arm in the war. But they proved that modern war could be won not through battlefield heroics, but through patient, methodical destruction of the enemy's ability to wage war. Within that larger story of destruction and victory live smaller stories of individual choices, of submarine commanders who faced decisions that couldn't be resolved by consulting regulations or orders. Most chose duty over mercy, mission over compassion, completing their patrols without deviation, sinking enemy ships without hesitation, adhering strictly to the doctrine of unrestricted submarine warfare that demanded total commitment to destruction. They were not wrong to make those choices. War demands such decisions, and submariners who hesitated didn't survive long enough to wrestle with moral complexity. But James Holloway chose differently. On March 14, 1945, in waters northeast of Saipan, he heard dying men tapping on a pressure hull and decided that answering distress calls mattered more than following doctrine. He risked his crew, compromised his patrol, violated regulations, and saved 23 enemy sailors who would have died without intervention. Whether that decision was right or wrong remains debatable. What's undebatable is that it was human, that it represented a choice to remember that warriors are also sailors, and sailors answer when drowning men call for help. The legacy of that choice rippled through the decades in ways impossible to measure. The Japanese submariners who survived told their children and grandchildren about American enemies who became rescuers, who demonstrated that honor and mercy existed even in total war. Those children and grandchildren grew up in a post-war Japan that rebuilt its relationship with America, based partly on stories like this. Small acts of humanity that complicated the narrative of pure hostility and suggested that enemies could recognize each other's dignity even while trying to kill each other. On the American side, the crew of Swordfish carried the memory of that day for the rest of their lives. The sound of desperate tapping, the decision to surface and risk everything, the sight of Japanese sailors breaking surface from depth, the knowledge that they had saved dying men when they could have sailed away. That memory shaped how they understood their service, what the war had demanded from them, and what they had managed to preserve despite everything the war tried to take. In the final accounting, the rescue of 23 Japanese submariners from I-177 by USS Swordfish changed nothing about the Pacific War's outcome. Japan still surrendered in August 1945. The submarine blockade still strangled the empire. American forces still achieved complete victory. But in the smaller, more personal accounting of individual lives and moral choices, the rescue changed everything for the men involved. It proved that duty and compassion weren't incompatible, that warriors could remain human, that the sea's oldest laws, that you answer distress calls, that you save shipwrecked sailors, that you don't let men drown when you have the means to save them, survived even the most brutal war in human history. Commander James Holloway's decision to answer the tapping from a dying submarine exemplified the complex moral landscape of the Pacific War, where absolute enemies sometimes recognized their shared humanity in moments that transcended the conflict consuming them.